this hopefully quick overview of soft proofing. It's one thing that we get a lot of questions about, and it's the same concepts no matter what piece of software you're using, but the techniques and the tools available to you are a little different. So Adobe has Lightroom and Photoshop that have different options than, say, Capture One. And Jim's been using Capture One for a while, and we've started to get a lot more people asking about Capture One. So we're going to try to integrate that into our demos as much as possible and as time allows. We'll start off today in Lightroom because I'm going to guess that's what a lot of our audience is using. All right, here we are in Lightroom. So I made a quick collection of just a few images, and Lightroom, in terms of soft proof, has not a whole lot of options when you're looking at papers. The really can be helpful thing that Lightroom does offer within the software is the ability to see if the colors are out of gamut on your monitor, which can help if you're working on a laptop or an older display or something like that that might have a smaller gamut. But what we should start with before we get into any of these settings is, if you're going to soft proof successfully, you must have calibrated your display. And we talk about this in almost every webinar, but what that does is that verifies that the colors you're seeing on the screen are number accurate, 1-to-1 for the colors in the file. And then it knows what's the black point of the screen, what's the white point, what's in gamut, what's out of gamut, all that sort of thing. So if you haven't calibrated your display, your soft proof is never going to be 100% successful because you're not playing by a defined set of parameters. And it may say, oh, this is in gamut, this is out of gamut for your print, which is great, that will be accurate. But the part of just verifying your image on the monitor, you're not going to be able to be 100% confident that's accurate. So first step in a soft proof is to go back, and if you haven't, calibrate your screen. So I am working on a calibrated screen, and here's a few images that I've been working on. And the one thing that you'll find overall, as displays have gotten better, cameras have gotten larger gamut, printers have more ink colors, is that fewer and fewer colors in your image will be out of gamut in the print. What you will probably end up using soft proofing for is, how do the shadows look, and what's the level of saturation in the final, and all those sorts of things. So these are more kind of true to life images and true to life edits. So it would surprise me if we start working with stuff that's way out of gamut. So to do a soft proof in Lightroom, you select your image, go to the develop module, and then down above the film strip, for me it's above the film strip because that's at the bottom of the screen, check this box here for soft proofing. And then back above your tool palettes, you'll see the option to select your profile, which is your print profile, your output profile, then your rendering intent, whether that's perceptual or relative. And as we've talked about in the past, the difference between those is relative colorimetric only adapts the colors that are out of gamut, and it leaves the in-gamut colors alone. So relative colorimetric is going to be the most accurate to what you see on the screen because it does the least amount of editing. Perceptual will adapt all of the colors as necessary in gamut and out of gamut to keep the relationships the same. So perceptual will keep your transitions and your gradients with the same amount of value shift between the two, but it might change everything if one of those colors is out of gamut. And then what you won't see in Lightroom, if you select relative colorimetric, is you won't see an option to turn black point compensation on or off. It's on all the time. Very rarely, if ever, would you need to turn it off, and that's why you don't get that option. So with relative colorimetric, black point compensation takes any tone in the image that's darker than the maximum black in the paper and moves it up into the printable space so that your shadows don't block up and lose all their detail. And then the last checkbox here is simulate paper and ink. So this is one of those can be useful, can be a little confusing options, because what the simulate paper and ink does is it looks at the white point and the black point in the color profile, and it also looks at the underlying paper color. So when you're looking at this on your screen and you toggle it on or off, you may notice that your image turns blue or your image turns a bit yellow. And what that is that's the software trying to interpret, oh, this is a very white, maybe luster paper with some optical brighteners. So technically it's a bluer paper, or maybe it's a warm tone cotton paper, say the Entrada Rag Natural, that is, again, by measurement, a little bit yellow. So when you check this, you may think, wow, why is my image suddenly a little yellow, or why is my image suddenly a little blue? Well, it's not actually changing the file. And very likely if you print it, it's not going to come out looking blue or yellow. That's just the software trying to interpret how that paper is going to look. So you can toggle this on and off, but as a practice, I don't leave it on all the time that I'm editing in a soft proof. And then to find it, so first of all, you can toggle this on and off, just selecting your soft proofing. Then you can also go up to the view menu. So again, view, soft proofing. So show proof, you can turn that on or off. Destination gamut warning is your print, whatever your output is. So this will show you what colors in your image are out of gamut for the paper profile that you chose. Then the second one, again, this is unique to Lightroom in the Adobe suite, is the monitor gamut warning. So that will show you if any colors are out of gamut on your monitor. And this is really helpful if you're doing the destination gamut warning. I know everything's in gamut just about, but when I look at the print, there's this green that doesn't match or something else. Well, then I could go to the view soft proof or monitor gamut warning, which is already on here. But sometimes that will reveal that, oh, that color that's not coming out in my print, it's not because the print is inaccurate or the printer can't do it. It's because I'm actually not seeing it correctly on my display. And again, with newer displays and 10-bit displays and that sort of thing, it's rarely going to be something that you'll have to dig into, but certainly with older laptop displays or older desktop displays, based on the hardware that you have, that might be something that could be really helpful in how you're working. So to double back to the beginning, selecting that profile. Now you'll notice here in Lightroom, I know that on this machine, I have probably 300 color profiles installed, but here in Lightroom, I only see 5. And that's because Lightroom by default doesn't show you all your profiles that are installed. So if you open this and you think, I just downloaded and installed a profile this morning, it's not on the menu, what do? Well, you scroll to the bottom here and you select Other. And Other in alphabetical order will show you every profile installed on your computer. And when you find the ones that you're looking for, in this case, we're looking for Moab profiles for the Canon Pro 300. So I'm looking for Juniper. And Museum Rag. And also Photo Matte. So there's 1, 2. Hopefully you don't have this many profiles installed, so you'll find these a lot faster. Okay. So now those 3 profiles have been loaded here to my list. So now we can take a look at this image and see if I were to print this on the LaSalle Photo Matte, there's a lot of the green that is out of gamut. So again, view, soft proofing, destination gamut warning, and turn that on or off. But the first thing that I'm more interested in is, okay, so I can't, on the Photo Matte on the Pro 300, I can't print those greens 1-to-1. So I'm going to go back to show proof, which is this S. I'm going to turn it on and off. And you can hopefully see that my image gets just a little darker because it's a matte paper. And those greens, they get to me just a bit dull relatively, but it's not going to make a huge difference in the image. So this is one of those images where I can see what's going to change, but it doesn't materially change how the print's going to look. So it's less of a concern for me. And I did notice that the camera switched off here. So Paige, why don't you ask a question and I'm going to bring my face back to the webinar.
Actually, what I was going to say real quickly was, too. You can be a perfectionist and want to have all of the image in perfect gamut, and you want to reproduce everything exactly the way it is. And to do that, you've got a lot of tweaks that you're going to have to make beyond the image that you see. You're going to have to make some sacrifices here or there, which may mean that you're going to have to do some masking, and you may have to use Photoshop as opposed to Lightroom, which you can bounce back and forth between to mask specific colors. Or you can make artistic judgments as to, I know I want this, I know I want this, and if this goes a little bit out of gamut, sometimes out of gamut isn't horrible.
And it's been my opinion, I guess, that you're almost always better off letting the rendering intent handle the color adaptation, because first off, it's only, if you select relative, it's only going to change the colors that are out of gamut. It's not going to mess with anything else. And it's extremely difficult sitting at the computer to try to target just those colors and mask them. I think the only time that you would really want to do that as a benefit is if for some reason the rendering intent is putting it in a place that you don't want it. But again, you would want to have tested relative colorimetric and perceptual to see which one looked better at that point. But we do often get that question sometimes is, oh, how do I edit for this? Well, you shouldn't have to edit for it. That's what the software is for, unless that's something that you really want to delve into. But that's just, to me, seems like a lot of personal challenge when we could push the button and get it done.
As we talked about earlier, there is an image that I sent you early on that has a ton of blue in it. It's almost all out of gamut. It still prints. It still prints beautifully. It's doing the soft proof, going through all the steps, getting it as close as you can, and then make a little test. It's the best thing you can do is run a small sheet through your printer and take a look and see what you got. It is truly all about printing. It's, the print is your ultimate expression of what you saw. And so that's the best way to do it. Just like we did in the darkroom, where we'd make a test print. And sometimes you may want to put a curve adjustment layer that's staggered over your print just to see what happens if you do it.
Yep. So with this image, typically I don't let the in-gamut, out-of-gamut drive what paper I'm going to select, but it is a tool that, especially if you're looking to try a couple of new papers or you're wondering about something, even if you don't have the paper, you can download the profile and you can say, well, I'm used to the LaSalle photo mat. And in this combination, I noticed that, like I said, a lot of the green is out of gamut. Well, what if I go to something like the museum rag that's a heavier weight cotton paper? It's still a matte. It's a little warmer surface. But because of the different characteristics of the paper, a lot more of my greens are in gamut. So again, if you've made a test and you look at this and you can say, wow, I really do want those greens to maintain their level of vibrancy, I'm going to go ahead and use the museum rag instead of the photo mat for this image.
And Evan, that was one of the questions was, could you please comment on the matte versus luster papers, as the matte proofing is a little bit trickier?
Yeah, and that's all going to depend, again, on the values in the image and what you're looking for in the final product. So if we switch to another image here with a lot of shadow detail, a lot of darkness in the foreground, again, if we go to the photo mat, there's a bit of it that's out of gamut. And then again, if I turn off the simulate paper and ink, it's gonna brighten it up just a little bit, because again, it's showing me the screen versus if I turn it on, that paper. But then the last piece of it is you can kind of turn that proof on and off, and hopefully it shows for you. But when I turn the proof off, the foreground lightens up a bit. When I turn the proof on, the foreground darkens up. So if I select the Juniper Burrito, which is a satin finish, again, it has a little larger gamut, so that gamut warning changes. But then when I turn the proof on and off, there's less change in those shadow areas. So what you may find is if I turn the exposure down on this, it's at 0.5, I'm going to take it to 0. That really darkens up that foreground. And I'm looking at that on the juniper here. So if I then switch this to, say, the photo matte, it doesn't change a lot, but it changes a little bit. So this is where you're going to go back and forth between maybe a satin or a glossy or a Baryta that you're looking at, and then perhaps a matte, and see how that works. And then the second part to this, which we've discussed in other webinars, is if you're looking to make a big print, have your image sized at that size, and then make a smaller proof print of just a piece of that image. So in this image, as we've often discussed, I'm not worried about the sky. Most of the trees on the horizon are silhouetted. What I want to know is, how is all of this foreground? So I might do a smaller print of just a little bit of the horizon and a big piece of the foreground here, so I can compare that to my soft proof and see how it looks.
Andrew, do you have a few questions? Could you quickly show how you select the out of gamut proof?
Yeah, so again, to see what colors are out of gamut, you go to the View menu, Soft Proofing, and then the Destination Gamut warning shows what will be out of gamut in your print. So if I turn that off, the red disappears. View, Soft Proofing, Destination Gamut warning, turn it on, the red reappears. Again, that's, I think, Shift-Command-S on the Mac, or Shift-S. Shift-S on the Mac. And then here you have the same options that you have over to the right between relative and perceptual and simulate paper and ink. So everything except the gamut warning can be done over in the proof settings palette. And then you can turn that warning on and off.
Will it show color and dynamic range out of range also?
So the purpose of the rendering intent is to move, again, your highlight and your shadows into the printable space. So a soft proof won't show your tones that are potentially out of gamut. It won't say this is too white or this is too dark. It just works on color values, not lightness values. But those lightness values are adjusted by the rendering intent.
Well,
Can you use the,
sorry.
Could you use the red highlighting from the out of gamut warning to create a mask to change just the out of gamut color?
Yeah, like we talked about, I personally wouldn't do that because I want to let the rendering intent do its thing. But if that's something that you want to do in your workflow, then yes, you potentially could. If we zoom in, you could conceivably mask around that. But again, there are different values in this mask. So it's a bit of a challenge to know exactly what values are in that mask and where do they need to go, because it doesn't say this is a little too brown, it needs to be a little more red or something like that. So the soft proof doesn't give you a direction in which to edit. It just gives you a notice that this particular color is out of gamut.
Got it. Someone's asking, the lab I use will only tell me their printer prints in CMYK. They won't give them any paper info. Their files are sRGB. They sometimes come back from the printer and the paper or the print isn't as vibrant. How can he soft print his sRGB file to see what it will look like in CMYK?
So there's a few pieces here. My personal opinion is that if you're working with a lab that just says, oh, it's in CMYK, we can't help you, maybe look for a different lab that will give you an output profile and give you some guidance on that, because working with a lab should be a partnership. You shouldn't just be handing off your files and hoping you get something back that's good. Secondly, sending out your images in sRGB, that is the smallest color space we have to work with. So as we're going through this, you know, Lightroom here is using the raw file, and the settings that I have are for 16-bit Adobe RGB. Jim uses similar settings. Some people even use ProPhoto RGB. So when you're sending out a file to the lab in sRGB, you're condensing all the possible colors in that image into a pretty limiting color space. So I always advocate, when you're sending stuff out or when you're opening raw files in Photoshop, either be in Adobe RGB, or if you've read up on it and you want to use it, be in ProPhoto RGB. But sRGB it's great for the web, it's great for Instagram, but it's not great for printing. So I would say use a bigger color space on that, and find a lab that's willing to work with you, because it should be a two-way street.
Yep.
And when someone checks the soft proof later on, they can't get it to make a proof copy. Do you know how to fix that?
I have not made proof copies in Lightroom. I know that there's an option for that.
Would you make a virtual copy of the image, get it to where you want it, and then make a virtual copy of that with the adjustments, and then start to proof with that, making adjustments on that virtual copy to get the proof that you want, or the print that you want?
That seems like a reasonable workaround. I know that it just gave me an alert about creating a proof copy when I was changing those settings. So I'm not 100% sure where that is, but we can certainly look into that. But yeah, I think creating a virtual copy and making adjustments and then rechecking that is a great way to go, because then you retain the original image edits. And then you can even probably name that virtual copy, you know, for the paper, as though we would do a version in Photoshop that you're adjusting just for that output.
Correct. By making that virtual copy, you're preserving what your initial intent was when you edited it originally. The virtual copy for print just edits it so that you can then print it in the way that you intended. So you don't change, so you can present it on your screen. Okay, here's my intent. And then you've got one that nobody's actually going to ever see on your screen, and that's what's coming out of your printer. Yep. And so that way, I think you get to where you need to be. Like, you may want to pull, in this case with your with this image, you may want to pull a gradient up on this grass to lighten it up so that you can see into it. Maybe add a little bit of texture or clarity, and maybe open your blacks just a touch in order to render that in a way that you want. And then pull the highlights down a little bit on where on the area of your sun. That's going to give you a print that is more, quote, in-gamut. There you go.
And someone else suggested that there's a checkbox above the ICC profile box that allows you to create a soft proof copy.
Yeah, I thought there was, and that's of course disappeared for me, but we'll get there. And then you can see here, as I was kind of walking along with Jim, and I made the mask and I've started editing the foreground. Well, in this case, I've actually created now some little points of out of gamut as I'm lightening my foreground. So it's, again, just like everything we talk about, there's no laws here. They're just ideas and suggestions and workflow tips to get you to whatever destination you're trying to reach. So, you know, play around with this, make a proof copy. There's no wrong answer. You're not going to mess up your image. You know, you can always go back and start again. And if we go back to the darkroom analogy, you haven't spent 2 hours on prints and chemicals and time and paper and everything else, hoping you get it right. So yeah, this should be an integral part of your printing process once you've edited the photo to where it fits the vision that you had when you took the image.
We do have a few more questions. As my paper is fixed, and if my photo has parts that are out of gamut, how can I use curves to fix?
Color is in and of itself a luminosity.
Yes.
So with a curve, you can target a specific area of the color with the little pointer, so that you can bring its luminosity down. Or you can choose hue saturation and again target, because hue is a luminosity. Saturation is luminosity, and lightness is luminosity. So there are different ways to attack things. And in using each of those adjustments, at least in Photoshop, by changing your blending modes, you're working within those luminosities to point all those little ones and zeros that are what make up your digital photo back into a place that you can pull it to the gamut that you want. If that makes any sense. I hope it does.
It does. Well, and I think that's a perfect segue into Jim's section on Capture One. And if we have more Lightroom questions at the end, I'm happy to follow up on those. But in order to keep moving, I'm going to exit out of here, and Jim, jump us into Capture One.
Okay. Hi, guys. And I'm going to pull up Capture One, and I've got a number of these little guys here. So one of the files that I sent to Evan is this, and this is after I've played with it a bit. This is actually the raw file, and I'm going to reset it. So that's the image that I made in Paris at Versailles a number of years ago. The reason I chose this was it's got a good amount of tone to it. You can see sort of where it was, and you can see what my basic initial exposure was. I wanted to make sure I had enough shadow, but I still managed my brightness. In Capture One, you're always proofing this little, even with the little icon, the little proof icon highlighted, that's showing me my gamut warnings, but I can turn that off. I'm still proofing. What Capture One does is it uses your export recipe, this section. So if I were to just click export, I'm going to export this as a TIFF, a 16-bit TIFF in Adobe RGB and at a specific size. But I'm not really using this for that. I'm using this so that I can see what it's going to do on my paper. So I need to come down and not use Adobe RGB, but use one of the ICC profiles that I've got stored on. So I'm going to change that Adobe RGB profile to Somerset Museum Rag. And I'm going to go find, since this is, let's see, is that the one that I typically use? Yeah, it is. And I'm going to change that. And I hope you saw the change in what my image is going to look like. Now that I know that, and I've got it as a TIFF, I've got it as a 16-bit TIFF, I'm going to get a lot more color with a 16-bit TIFF, and I'm going to have much easier consistent gradations in color and in luminosity. I know what my size is. Right now I have it set for no sharpening. I'm going to sharpen it for the print right there. And I'm going to close this. And now I'm going to put back the proofing. And you see now it's changed exactly to the profile for Somerset Museum Rag. I can also change those profiles by clicking on the little arrow, and I can toggle between all of them. So I can go to Juniper and say, oh, that's what it's going to look like in Juniper. Or I can say that I can go back to the Somerset, since those are my main papers. So then I would just simply make a tweak, or start to make tweaks and start to do some judgment. I might even go click on auto just to see what it does. And that sort of got me to the right place. And I'm going to come down here because I use my levels a great deal. And I'm going to get rid of that part of it. And I'm going to open my blacks up just a little bit. start to look for some things. Clone this and see what I got here first. And as you see, it's just it's sort of a lot of judgments to start to make to where you want to be. And Evan, you've got a final one because I can keep tweaking and tweaking and tweaking, but that's essentially the image that we got out of that. And I think I did do this. I sent it to you for Juniper.
Well, and when you look at it again, this is another little trick here. So here it is on Juniper, and it looks crisp and dense. And then if you go back under proofing, if you go back to Museum Rag, it makes it look a little flatter. But again, that's just the software trying to show that there's a little less contrast range in the matte. But when you print it, it doesn't necessarily come out looking like that it's suddenly lost some contrast. And that's really something that you just have to, as you're working with papers, and as you say, the Museum Rag or the Entrada is something that I'm going to want to use, you'll get used to in your mind of how the image actually changes on the paper versus how the screen previews that it may look on the paper.
The other thing with Capture One that Evan talked about was the rendering intent. And so if I come down to print, here I have it set up, and I can change from perceptual to relative. And as you can see, there was a change. At least I hope you can see. This has black point compensation. Doesn't really change anything. I always just to see what I'm going to get, I change it to saturation. I change it to color metric. I like to play just to see. It's how I learn. And so there you go. So this pretty much tells me now what I'm going to get if I make that print on a P800, on letter size, and everything else. Let's just see what happens. So that's Capture One really in a nutshell. If you don't have that little proofing icon up there, you can get it a couple of different ways. One, you can click on the bar, and you can customize your toolbar. And you'll see this. You find the proofing icon, which I've already dragged on there, so it's not here. But you would literally just drag it to wherever you want it. Just like if I want this, let's pretend this preferences button is my proofing icon. I would just drag it there and place it. And now I've got it. So that's one way to do it. Or I can come here to view, and I can make sure that I have proof profile highlighted and recipe proofing highlighted. And then I'm pretty much good to go. And that's basically how I would use Capture One to print. That said, and if I want to be really totally honest, my Capture One is mostly for tethered shooting and to show clients on location quick edits, really. I have no compunction about taking an image and editing in Capture One, bouncing it into Photoshop, and doing some final work on it in Photoshop. I tend to use as many tools as I have. I might as well I have them. So why not use all of them?
Yeah, I think we've had more and more requests for Capture One, as it's probably one of the only software that still gives you the option to do a single licensed copy without having to do a subscription.
Although they are starting to move away from that.
Right, of course.
Especially with the ability to have it on your iPad and to share contact sheets and things online. They really want you to go to a subscription. They want to go to that same model where if you subscribe, they'll update it on and on and on, and you don't have to buy it all the time. So you're going to get it that way as it is. And Not too bad.
Not bad at all. So there's two questions here that have come up that we may have touched on, we may not have. Someone's asking, what is the best rendering intent perceptual relative? Well, again, that is going to be determined by which look you prefer. And secondly, the more out of gamut colors you have, the more typically perceptual is going to give you a cleaner print, we'll call it.
And Evan, then, to go along with that, someone else was asking, if we default to perceptual gamut, would our prints not always be in color gamut?
Well, again, your gamut is determined by your printer and the paper that you've chosen. So all the Moab papers on the Canon Pro 300 that's behind me all have different gamuts. And if we then take those same papers and we print them on the Pro 4000, same papers, same printer company, different gamuts, because the inks are different and everything else like that. So all the rendering intent does is take the out of gamut colors and put them in gamut. It doesn't do anything else with your image besides that.
And someone else was asking, should print lab customers ask that lab if they are using, if the lab uses custom paper profiles?
I think that's not something that I would necessarily ask. There are a lot of labs that we work with that do use the profiles that we have created because, you know, we're using the same machines. And generally those profiles, you know, we do our best to make the best profile we can use, and the labs can use that. If you have a lab that part of their service is custom profiling, or they've had a profile made for their machine, you know, that might bring a small improvement, but it's not something that I would use when qualifying whether I'm going to work with a lab or not.
Right. And many times they certainly will post their profiles for you to download so that you can try and match what they're going to output. That said, there's a lot of trust that you've got to, you know, do it. And in many cases, if you upload a file to a lab using Adobe RGB 1998 as your profile, you're going to be pretty assured that you're going to get what you want, generally. And if you're using a good lab, I think that's the best thing that you can do is try the lab out, test them. And there are a bunch of really good labs out there that will send you proofs. And that's what you want to do.
Yeah, and it should be a partnership, because they're doing you a service, and if you're trusting them with your images, they should be a trusted partner of yours, because they're part of your creative process and they're part of your commercial success and everything else like that.
If I was going to make a 40 by 60 print, I know that I might first get an 8 by 10 print from that lab of what I want, of the 40 by 60, just to take a peek at it, see what they're going to do with it. Then I might order the 40 by 60 after I get that 8 by 10 or 8 by 12 back. Just as a lot of times when I'm working, if I want to make a large print on my Canon 2100, which prints up 24 inches wide, I'm going to set up a print that's a 4 by 6 on that same paper, and I might tile it so that I can see what I'm going to get, and then I'm going to run the big print. Before I run the big print, why waste paper? Why waste ink?
Well, before we run out of time, let's quickly move into Photoshop, which is going to be a similar workflow to Lightroom, but it does give you a few more options and some options in different places.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another thing that we can cover in Photoshop here that we haven't before, but it's a good thing to keep in mind, especially if you're working on an image that you're going to want to make some adjustments to. So this is a raw file in Adobe Camera Raw before I open it in Photoshop. And I'm just going to quickly have it do some automatic adjustments and then back those off a little bit.
Going to auto to begin with,
yep.
With, you know, given the profile that you're using, going to auto just to begin with, because you can always change it when you're shooting wrong, is always a good idea. It sort of gives you an idea on what the computer thinks, or where it's placing all the little numbers that you've just created. And it gives you a good starting point. It also gives you the opportunity to go back and say, yeah, no, that's not what I had in mind at all. But at least you have a good starting point here.
So what we've talked about in the past a lot is that here at the bottom of the screen, you have your Adobe RGB 8 or 16-bit and those options. So always I recommend Adobe RGB, and then depending on your workflow, 8-bit or 16-bit. But the other option that you have is when you go to open this image, you can select to open it as an object. And what that does is when you open it as an object, you have the ability to go back to Camera Raw and make adjustments from the raw file instead of making adjustments from the file that you've opened. So this can be kind of an advanced editing piece, because here we are with our image here, but when I go to the soft proof, if there's something I see that I want to change, I can go to my layers palette and I can click on this image and I can send it back basically to Camera Raw to make adjustments. So I'm making adjustments again from the raw file, not from adjustments that I'm laying on the final file. So if I need to pull up more detail in my shadows, I'm going to be a lot more successful working from the raw file than working from a JPEG or an 8-bit TIFF or that sort of thing. If you open it as a 16-bit file in Photoshop, this is less of maybe an advantage, but it's still something to keep in mind as you're building your soft proof workflow and your printing workflow and what makes sense to you. So I have this image open. I've done, we'll say, my adjustments. And now I'm going to go to View, Proof Setup, Custom. And then in Photoshop, the terms are a little different. Device to simulate is your print profile or your output profile. So here we have the Juniper Brighter Rag on the Pro 300. Immediately below that, we have the rendering intent. So we're in Lightroom, we had 2. In Photoshop, it gives you 4, but you're pretty much going to ignore saturation and absolute color metric. Those aren't really meant for printing accurate photographs. They're meant for other things. So you're going to go between your perceptual and your relative color metric. And then here you can turn the black point compensation on and off. And then again, like we had in Lightroom, you have simulate paper color and simulate black ink. So as we talked about before, this reads those same values and tries to reproduce them on screen. So once you have this set, you can use the preview checkbox to toggle it on and off. We're going to toggle it on. I'm going to click OK. And then when I go back to the view menu, I can look at the gamut warning. And if you're used to Lightroom and Photoshop, this is just the destination or output gamut warning. And in this case, pretty much all of my colors are in gamut. So with that remaining on, I can go back to proof setup and I can select a different output profile. So we had looked at the photo matte, a bit more out of gamut, but again, nothing critical to my image. You can see when I turn the simulate paper color on, it does try to darken that sky a little bit because it's looking at the fact that that paper has a slightly smaller contrast range. And then the black point compensation, again, on and off, you can see it makes a little difference. But again, with relative color metric, no need to turn black point compensation off. And then the last one was the museum rag that we've been working with.
One thing too, when you've got blacks in, and you know it's a black in your image, if it's out of gamut, you should expect it to be out of gamut because it's black. There isn't any real detail in that. You still have a little bit of detail in those silhouettes, but not much. And you'd expect it to be out of gamut where it showed it was out of gamut.
And again, you can chase the perfect print in numbers where everything is in gamut and everything shows up on your screen and that sort of thing. But this is about aesthetics. We're not doing Pantone proofing for a brand color where it has to match 1-to-1 no matter what. We're making an aesthetic choice with our prints. So these are all tools to get you to the print so that it best matches your vision. But these are not necessarily things that you have to do to reach a specific value or to get perfect or to, like we've talked about, eliminate the out of gamut colors, because the software takes care of most of that. And then the rest of it is that there are colors, plenty of colors in nature or in the built environment that are out of gamut everywhere. And that's just because we can still see a lot more than we can capture or that we can print. So it's a toolbox of things to help you achieve your vision, but it's not a be-all destination to make this ultimate everything in gamut, every tone available print on paper.
And I don't know a single person who's an artist. And I think that in a lot of ways we all are, that are photographers, artists, that does their art simply by, oh, this is what that number's supposed to be. There's got to be a feeling or a perception within that. So trying to do it all by the numbers isn't necessarily successful.
So that's our tour of Lightroom, Photoshop, and Capture One. We have a question here that says, can you soft proof in Lightroom and then print in Photoshop? You certainly can, if that's how you want to work, because you're making your adjustments in Lightroom. Just make sure that when you open that image in Photoshop, you have your Lightroom settings to not open it as a JPEG or an 8-bit or whatever else. You want to make sure that what you're working with in Lightroom, those settings are mirrored when you open it in Photoshop. But yes, there's no problem in soft proofing in one and printing out of the other.
And that's what you would do with Capture One as well, because you've got an output recipe. You're going to output the image, literally output a file, and it will bounce over to Photoshop, open up, and it'll be ready to go with the ICC profile that you created when you created the recipe. And you should be fairly ready to go if you want to print out of Photoshop, or do some final tweaks and then print.
And then a few more questions that we have here. So I understand opening an image as an object. Is there an equivalent going from Lightroom to Photoshop?
When you open an image, when you send an image from Lightroom to Photoshop, it's sort of equivalent, because you could go back into Lightroom and re-edit that raw file and send it again. But when you send an image from Lightroom to Photoshop, it does, I would say, it commits that image data to pixels. So it's going to make a PSD or a TIFF or a JPEG out of it.
Would you,
again, if it's a 16-bit TIFF or a 16-bit PSD, you retain most of that data, unless you're going to do some crazy adjustment to white balance or something else, which you would have already done.
Could you not go ahead, send the PSD or send the TIFF over to Photoshop, duplicate that layer, and then use that layer, and I believe you can create an object out of that layer, so that you're then bouncing it into Camera Raw if you want to readjust. But that way you've got your initial file, your initial edit. Your duplicated layer means that it's non-destructive, and you can work from there.
Yeah, and that's pushing the boundaries of what I normally do in Photoshop. So Jim, you actually got a question. Can you talk a little more about your workflow for adjusting specific colors in Photoshop?
Sure. Let's just, okay, well, I'm here in Photoshop, and this was an image that I made down in Antarctica 3 years ago, or a little longer than that, 4 years ago. And this is open as a smart object. But as far as adjusting colors, there we go. Okay. Now hopefully you can see everything.
Yes.
So, all right. I'm going to go and strip this down to the original. So that's the original smart object after I'd processed it out of the raw file. So if I double click, now I'm in camera raw because I opened it as an object, which means I can also go back and I can reset to default. That's the default. That's the initial capture. I tend to not use landscape neutrals. I go right to camera neutral. For me, that's an important part of my workflow. I'll go ahead and open this up. And I get this little warning. Okay, so now if I want to create a hue saturation layer, I've got that there. I have 3 different types of luminosities: hue, saturation, and lightness. If I want to work on saturation, I'm actually going to take this down and I'm going to select saturation. And now I can sit there but you see how I got different luminosities? See how it went lighter or darker by targeting that color? If I want to work on the lightness, I'll take that same layer, I just made a new hue saturation layer, and take it down to luminosity. And now I'm going to target the color and make it lighter or darker. In my case, I do a lot of masking. Guilty as charged. So I can do it in 2 different ways. I can duplicate this layer, and then I can then go back into camera raw. And one of the things that I like about Adobe these days is their masking. So I'm just going to say select subject, and guess what? It just masked that for me. And so now I can lighten that sucker up, and I've always had a hard time totally selecting that as well as I'd like, and bring this down just a little bit. And now very quickly, I've just gotten a much better rendition, as I really remember it, of what that bird looked like. If I need to add to it, I'd select the brush. I'd come in here and maybe add just a little bit, and I did it sloppily, but it's still there. And I could refine it a little bit more, but I think you all get the idea. And I want to subtract a little bit of that with the brush. But all of this is artistic consideration for me, and how I want to present it to my viewer, and how I want to be able to tell the story of what that night was. So I'm going to say that's fine. I'm going to say okay. And a lot of times, that one thing that I do is I finish off my file with a curves layer, just to sort of make sure that I can get the way I want it. I'm going to go down here and make that luminosity, because I've changed that luminosity. Sometimes for me, I lose a little bit of saturation, but you can see the difference that made. It's going to be a lot easier to print that way. I'll go in, make another saturation layer, add a little bit of saturation. That's just me. I tend to oversaturate, and I go down. Again, I target my layers as to what they are by what they are. So if I just change the saturation, I make it saturation in its blend mode. I hope that helps, and I hope that explains what I'm doing.
Yeah, and then if you wanted to at this point, if you were going to go do a soft proof and maybe some of your saturated colors are out of gamut, you could go back to that saturation layer. If you wanted to make your own adjustments, reduce it a bit, and then perhaps it would be back in gamut again.
Yep. Do you preserve your RGB number 7 or not?
No, definitely not.
So you can start to see by simulating paper what it's going to do. And that tells me I'd need to saturate it even more.
But now if you go to show your gamut warning, so hit OK and go to view gamut warning.
And I'm just clipped in here.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a bad thing.
So with that on, you could go back to your saturation layer and you could even turn it up a bit and see what happens.
Mm-hmm. Let me just get this down so that you all can see. You can see the more I go.
So if you're specific, so if you were to look at this, you'd say, wow, I want to saturate it, you know, plus 25 for my print. Well, if you go to plus 25, you can see that you're not going to be able to push a lot more saturation out of that file because you're just creating out of gamut colors. Correct. So that's another good tool to say, oh, this is a sunset. I want it to be super punchy. Well, when you picked a paper, turn on your gamut warning and then go make that hue or saturation adjustment and see, are you creating something that looks beautiful on the screen but doesn't translate to print, or what's the limitation of how much you can saturate those colors before you're forcing the software to do more work and not change the output.
And using this little picker is huge because you can go in and target that magenta and push it. And look, I've really targeted. The one thing you got to be careful about is artifacting, because if I go in, I'm going to take this up to 100%. If I go in, now I didn't do any noise reduction or anything with this, but when I click on that magenta and come back, I don't want to see it do that.
Yep.
But in here, I've got a lot of color. And if I'm going to be claimed to be sort of a abstract whatever, or surrealist almost, that's a surreal color right there. But I know that it's not out of gamut. Just as I may want to click that blue and saturate it. So I know I'm only going to lose it here. Okay, if I'm losing it there, right? And I still want to see it, I haven't lost it in a lot of places and I really want to push that blue up. Okay, now I've got a layer mask. I've got a black brush and I'm going to take the opacity down to about 25%. And now I can go over, I'm going to make that a little bit bigger, that brush. And I can start to paint it out, especially if I use black. And I've just corrected for the gamut issue. So I got what I wanted as far as the saturation. And now I can bring it carefully in a way so that I can unify all that gamut issue that, as you see right there, and that little bit of gamut issue, I've gotten the blue that I wanted, and all I've lost is that, and that's a little bit out of gamut, but guess what? I don't think it's going to be a problem.
And then keep in mind that all of these adjustments that you're making are you're basically making a proof copy here for that paper on that printer. So if you suddenly change your paper, you're going to want to make sure that you can go back and make some different adjustments, because your out of gamut is going to increase or decrease, or your shadows are going to decrease or increase. That's right. So I would go ahead and save this, as iceberg dual semi-gloss P800, and maybe even put the date on it so I know when I did it. And then if you want to go back to edit that, or if you want to change the papers, that you have a copy of all the work that you've done, just reflecting that. And the last thing that I use here is you still have the Photoshop default gamut warning of, it's kind of a light gray. And I find that to not stand out very much. So if you quickly, since you have your screen up, Jim, if you go to the Photoshop menu and then preferences, transparency and gamut, it's like 5 more down, right 2 up right there. Then right, that second thing says gamut warning, and it's got the light gray color box, the second section.
Right here.
If you
Yep.
click on that, yep, I make my gamut warning like a fluorescent pink so that it really stands out in my images. But you can pick any color available in the Photoshop color picker, click OK again, and then there's your gamut warning that really sticks its thumb out so it notices. And I think that's been a tool that helps me, because especially if there's not a lot of added gamut, if it's light gray, I might totally miss it. But if it's fluorescent yellow or fluorescent pink, it'll immediately show up to me and I can say, is that important? Is that not important? And move forward.
And I think that one thing that, especially because everyone can see my histogram there, you know, the more that you have a quote perfect histogram, the easier it's going to be to print, to be honest. At least that's been my experience. And that's a pretty good, I'm a little light on highlights, but then again, how many real highlights do I have here? You know, I don't, I'll go back and choose my picker. You know, that's where my white is. So I could push that up a little bit. You know, that's pretty much mid-tone for me. This is down in shadow. I'm in good stead. And printers seem to love to print midtones. And, you know, I'd start to think about printing this. I might come in and mask the sky and make that a little bit darker, keep the rest of it, and I think I'd have a pretty good print right there.
Well, it's a beautiful image, and thank you for that. I mean, I come to my own webinars and I learn something, so it's pretty fun.
It's nice. We have two different views of for this. It's nice.
Well, and I think that's what we all, that's what the takeaway should always be from any class that you go to: Photoshop, printing, Lightroom, how to use your camera, what lens, is it's all our best recommendation, but you know, it's not organic chemistry. You can do it 16 different ways and arrive at the same solution, as long as you know how to get to where you want to go and you know what you want to end up with. Just add to your toolbox and pick, you know, do you use the 16-ounce hammer, or do you use the 8-ounce hammer, or whatever else when you're in the workshop? What are you going to use in the software tools? Because it's all about achieving your vision easier, faster, and less frustrating. And there I go again.
but Evan's completely right. It really is about learning your tools. If you when you start using a camera, if you can remember the sunny 16 rule, that at 100 ISO on a bright sunny day, that your exposure is some derivation of a 60th at 16, and you go out and you start pointing your camera wherever and taking pictures using those settings, you're going to be successful with your exposures 9 times out of 10. So then all of a sudden you can forget about, well, what's my exposure supposed to be, and start to concentrate on, well, let's see, if I set the frame up this way, it's going to look like this. Or if I break the rule and underexpose, this is going to happen. Or if I overexpose, that's going to happen. And so then it's all starts to be about creativity. And that's what I think in the long run, all of this is about, is your creativity and how you can go out and function in a better or easier way to meet the goals that each person has for themselves.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Evan and Jim, for answering all these questions. And we will be doing a Q&A, hopefully in April or May. So if you have any other questions, feel free to hold on to them and we'll answer them there. And
we got one more question under the wire here, which is an important one. After calibrating the monitor, editing the softproofing, the final print is significantly darker. I would put money on the fact that when you did the monitor calibration, it was set to be too bright, because the challenge that we have every year is monitors get brighter and the paper doesn't get any brighter. So when you're doing your monitor calibration, you want to set your brightness somewhere between 120 and 160. And you should see that in there. It'll say 120 CDM squared. So that's candela per square meter. That's not important, but 120 to 160. 160 is sort of the ISO standard. For me, I'm more successful in matching my prints in my setup closer to 120, 130. But if you're above 160, your monitor is going to be too bright for your paper, and then everything is going to print dark because your screen is misrepresenting it. So when you do that calibration, 120 to 160 for your brightness, and that should help if your prints are too dark.
Calibrate, 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 and use the profiles. It makes a huge difference. It really, really does.
All righty.
Great. Well, thank you guys.
Thanks everybody.
Thanks for joining.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.